Welcome to Healthcare's Missing Link, a weekly podcast to help you uncover hidden things that steal your health. Thanks for joining us today. Here's your host, Dr. Mark Sherwood.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Healthcare's Missing Link, a podcast where we help you uncover those things that are missing to keep you from obtaining optimal health. I'm your host, Dr. Mark Sherwood, and I get the pleasure of bringing back one of our most popular guests and one of my dear colleagues who has been a great influence on Dr. Michelle and I's life. He's a practitioner, a functional medicine expert from the country of Denmark. He speaks all over the world. Umahro, Cadogen, welcome back.
Thank you.
So grateful. You know, we're in a time right now where the whole world is under this thing called a pandemic. It's COVID-19. Man, let's dive in here. It's affecting everyone's lifestyles, cultures, habits, etc. And some people are scared, some people are not. There's a lot of confusion. I've spoken my piece about this. I want people to hear from someone else that I have high respect for. What is COVID-19?
Well, I mean, COVID-19 is if you get an infection with this virus currently circulating around, it's called SARS-CoV-2. So the bug or the virus is called SARS-CoV-2. And then if you get an infection and you're ill, that's COVID-19. So it's like, it's just semantics, but there's the virus and then there's the disease. Right. And then you also have some people who will have SARS-CoV-2 and be carriers and be asymptomatic. So they don't have COVID-19, but they might still have been exposed or at some point harboring that infectious agent. And then, if you get COVID-19, the results can be anywhere from something that might just resemble having the flu, but also you'll have people who get severely ill, so they get very serious respiratory issues, they get circulatory issues, and then what's emerging, we also see all sorts of other organ damage, kidney damage, hepatic damage, neurological damage. Some people lose their sense of smell, and there certainly also are some people who get something that looks like very similar to mononucleosis, where they get the infection, they won't necessarily go to the hospital, they won't go on a ventilator, but then they're tired and fatigued for weeks or months afterwards. And there also seems to be an increase in chronic fatigue syndrome post-infection. Again, here we're just getting very early numbers because to diagnose chronic fatigue syndrome, really you need, for at least 6 months have unremitting fatigue that can't be explained for any other reason and live up to very specific diagnostic criteria. But there's things going on. Actually, one of my colleagues who out of Sweden, who's like a total can't say whiz kid because he's older than we are, but he is a whiz kid in terms of
probably in the area of about 35, right? Something like
exactly, that. Yeah, mid-30s, exactly. So, but he's doing, he's one of the best researchers in the world on all these sorts of biomarkers, and so they've been looking at biomarkers to try to distinguish, what happens when people get COVID-19 and they end up with a mono-like situation or chronic fatigue syndrome. So also, I think that needs to be put into perspective. I mean, people's main concern with COVID-19 is, I get ill to the point where I'll have to go on a ventilator. What if I die from that? That's certainly one complication, but actually we mainly see that in people who have pre-existing morbidity, right? So the people who end up on ventilators and who die or almost die tend to be the ones who are really old and frail just from age, or who have, classic diseases of civilization. They have type 2 diabetes not well regulated, or type 1 diabetes not well regulated, whereas if it's actually well controlled, not that much of an issue. They're massively obese, not just a bit, they have a bit of blubber they might want to get rid of. I want to look more fit for summer, for when the gym or when I go in the bedroom with my significant other. But, whether we're talking about serious obesity, that carries a much higher risk of getting really ill and dying, or people have, they already have like cardiac failure or have really severe cardiovascular disease. And of course, also if you have a lung disease in the first place, if you have chronic obstructive lung disease or severe asthma. So those things really increase the risk of people getting severely ill from COVID-19 in terms of respiratory distress and dying from that. I know in Denmark we've had less than 1,000. We've had less than 1,000 people whose deaths have some sort of association with COVID-19. I think it's about 800, but less than maybe 25 of those didn't have pre-existing morbidity. So maybe about 25, maybe it's 30 now. That last time I checked was a couple of weeks back, but only about 30 people have died directly as a consequence of the virus and COVID-19. But that being said, you have all these other people who get mild disease, but get all these knock-on effects. So it's not as, it's not fair to say it's just like a bad flu. It might be in terms of death, people who die directly compared to people who die because they're already weak and unhealthy or frail for many different reasons. But there is another picture emerging with people who get post-infectious complications, even if they don't get really ill, where they, for a long time, they're tired, or they might also have their breathing and airways affected, although they don't go on a ventilator, or cognitive, effects, and sensory issues, especially people who lose their smell their smell and also their ability to taste things. And there's also emerging that severe digestive upset could be an issue, because you can actually track the virus in people's digestive system. And in a couple of studies, they were looking at SARS-CoV-2 levels in sewage water, and that totally correlated with spread in that area. So, another way of testing, apart from doing a deep nasopharyngeal swab, might actually be to do stool samples, although no one's validated that. I mean, so one thing I think obviously when some people are going overboard and getting too scared or too restrictive, but on the other hand, it's not just another flu, and we don't know the full picture yet, because all these long-term consequences you won't know until you look for them and follow up. But it's still some, but then for like immediate death, I mean, one of the main issues is either age, but there any other infection do it, or that people have pre-existing diseases of civilizations. I think one thing, this is actually a wake-up call, that we still have work to do in terms of making sure people don't get metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, massively overweight, because that's where you get people who aren't over 80 who die from COVID-19. I think that's highlighted very clearly now. There's a long way to go. We shouldn't just look at like gross domestic product, GDP. We should look at gross national health as well. That should be a KPI at national level. From governmental levels and NGOs and so forth. We should be looking at that, because this just shows us there's another issue we already knew, and that puts a massive burden on the healthcare system. And if we could deal with that, we would fix two problems in one go.
Let me ask you this, because and I know there's really no right answer here, but let's say that we did fix the global health crisis. We eliminated diabetes, metabolic syndromes, and all those comorbidities those pathologies that conjunctively tie to that dastardly destructive process. Would we be having the same conversation right now if we corrected those things about this SARS-CoV-2/COVID-19?
No, we wouldn't, and for two reasons. One, some of the deaths, or maybe a lot of the deaths, wouldn't be there. On top of that, we wouldn't have a healthcare system that was already pushed to the brink. I mean, because in public healthcare systems, national healthcare systems, before this was dropped upon us or appeared, whatever way you want to phrase it, they were already pushed to, beyond capacity handling diseases of civilization, also, emergency medicine and so forth. And so if we didn't have that burden, we would have way more capacity in the healthcare system to deal with the people who got infections. Fewer people would get really ill from infections. So we would still have a conversation, but not the same conversation, by no means, and might not have had to, have draconian measures as well to curb the spread of the disease. Because I think the people who just say, "Oh, just let the disease run its course and we'll get herd immunity and so forth." No, that's a bit too laissez-faire, laid back, or that's not okay. But then the other interesting thing is some of the countries who have much less of an issue. One thing is what they do in terms of limiting disease transmission. But if you look at it, it's also interesting. Some of those populations are, from in a worldwide perspective, are relatively healthy. Like in the Far East, Korea, Japan, right? Taiwan, there's been way less spread. And one thing is that people are a lot more pertinent about hygiene and contact and spreading. But in general, not people are also healthier, or less unhealthy might be the way to say it, right? So I think that has impact. And again, and I can just do Danish numbers or statistics, right? So in Denmark, we've had less than 1,000 deaths from COVID-19, and a lot of those deaths is like COVID-19 was just the final drop that pushed people over the edge. At the same time, 17,000 people die every year in Denmark just from smoking, right? Wow. So so it's like, so again, and if you're a smoker, you also have a high risk of dying from COVID-19. So again, I think one thing is it highlights that there are these things that we've accepted, or these health problems in public health that haven't been dealt with, and there are many reasons why we haven't fixed that, that sort of like smoking and many other things. But now, just to put those numbers into perspective, now no one's ever done anything close to the measures we're putting in place now, different speed, different degree of intensity in the world, to stop smoking. But like in Denmark, okay, 17,000 people die every year. Then all the people who aren't dead yet, or who are ill but will survive, as in they're not clinically dead. And then we have something where 1,000 people, less than 1,000 people are dead, a lot from pre-existing morbidities. And we're doing all these things, and I don't disagree with what we're doing in Denmark to handle that. Why aren't we putting in just half the effort or a quarter of the effort to really deal with the underlying public health problems? We should be doing that.
Question, we know this, and the same thing is true in America. This as we like to say, the elephant in the room is our lifestyle. Yeah. Terrible. Why aren't we putting even half the effort? Why aren't we doing that? What's your opinion on that?
No, I mean, I think it's like, I mean, there are lots of things. So I think what's more important to say is that the one who can change something is yourself, right? I mean, at societal level, we've created an obesogenic society where it's harder to, unless you're very deliberate in your choices and very conscious, then it's easy to make a lot of choices that push you down a trajectory of poor health, and you become overweight and type 2 diabetes, disease of civilization. If you just sort of go with the flow, that's the right direction you will go. You literally have to choose consciously to go against the flow in another direction to not become unhealthy in a modern society. So it'd be nice if we just change the surroundings and everything, but that's not happening. So the one who can do something is yourself, although that might be a bit unfair. But it's a mix. It's a mix of things. Like we have the food industry, and I'm sure, I mean, none of the big players out there, they're not saying, we want everyone to die from cancer and obesity, but they say profit, and then say, well, it's not really our fault, because we're not stuffing burgers or fizzy drinks down your throat, and you could eat a bit of those once in a while, then eat lots of broccoli and kale and salmon, you'll be fine. But that's just not what people do, right? And there's this escalating arms race with advertising and highly palatable foods with low satiety, where, well, if they go a bit ahead, then they get the market. So now we're going to have to, so it's this escalating arms race for our palates. We have that at public level. We don't, there are all these things that are the wrong choices, the wrong legislation is there, the wrong structure, surroundings, and so forth. So all that, it ought to be changed, but that's not happening anytime soon. But if you as a person choose to do something different today, and for yourself, for your family, for your friends, that changes something. And the moment enough of us do something like that, we will force the big players to change, because we're not going to buy diddly squat of what you're selling or producing.
Well, I agree.
So either die, or go bankrupt, or feed us what we want,
Yeah.
So
I totally agree with that. It's interesting, we like to say that change the person staring at you in the mirror first, and don't spend time worrying about what everybody else does.
Exactly.
And people we sort of are around, and we're a little bit of a strange, a little bit of a freakish, a little bit of a weird group, but in reality, health and these things that we can do should not be weird or freakish. They should be more the norm. But to that end, what are some things, and I want you to go in the direction of, are there medications such as hydroxychloroquine / azithromycin? Does that help? What are some supplements that people should do? And what are some lifestyle things they should do to prepare themselves for probably not if, but when they're exposed to this SARS-CoV-2?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the basic foundation is like the fundamentals of health. Get moving every day. Start by eating real food. I tend to tell people use what I call the tea plate model. So if you imagine you have a tea, everything above the tea, which is half the plate, should be vegetables, berries, and fruits. And then you have 2 quarters left underneath. And so 1 quarter should be healthy, lean protein sources with healthy fats, and the other quarter, the remaining 25%, should be some healthy starch source, sweet potatoes, steamed normal potatoes, quinoa, chickpeas, that sort of thing. So do that and go for max amounts of vegetables. So do that. Obviously, if you smoke, find a way to stop. Easier said than done. If you drink too much, don't drink too much. And get controlled sleep and stress. We know that just stress or sleep deprivation generally increases your susceptibility to respiratory infections, both bacterial and viral. So just something as basic as that will already put you on a trajectory where your body is better equipped to handle if you're exposed. It lowers the risk of actually getting infected if you're exposed, or decreases the risk of you becoming severely ill, right? I mean, right. So that's like fundamentals, or just the starting point. Then we see in terms of nutrients, I mean, vitamin D certainly plays an important role. There are all these studies showing a correlation between higher vitamin D levels and lower rates of infection or better prognosis. So if you have higher vitamin D, you're less likely to get infected if you're exposed, or if you're infected, you're less likely to require going to the hospital, going to the emergency department in the hospital, going on a ventilator. So, so that there's certainly a link there. So make sure that your vitamin D levels are in place from sun exposure, from fatty fish, from supplementation, a combination. And also vitamin D is probably in general also a marker of health. So the more unhealthy people are, the higher the expenditure of vitamin D, right? So, you can have the same intake, and then someone who's really unhealthy will have lower levels because they use more to try to clear up or clean up the mess they're making with the wrong diet, environment, the wrong lifestyle. So make sure your vitamin D is, again, there are different units in the US and in Europe. So in Europe, I'd say be at least 80 nanomoles per liter. Ideally, probably about 100 nanomoles per liter. So I think that would translate into, go about with nanograms per deciliter you use in the US, right?
Correct.
Yeah. So make sure, I think, when you look at that, the studies that get to at least 35 nanograms per deciliter. And so there's something there. Also, there are studies showing there's a correlation between zinc levels and the rate of infection, or how severe the infection is. And also, in terms of preventing the cytokine storm that can causes a lot of the damage. People who then, if they're infected and become really ill because they have, an exaggerated immune response they can't bring to closure. So making sure you get enough zinc. And if you know Chris Masterjohn, he's following it closely. His newsletter, I think, from yesterday, so it's going to be a slightly different date when this is aired. But he brought 4 or 5 described medical cases of people who were infected, diagnosed, and then went on really high dose zinc, between 150 and I think 231 milligrams per day. Obviously not something you should be taking for preventive reasons. And all of them actually managed to stay out of the hospital and were back on their feet much faster than you would expect. Of course, that's not definitive proof, but it's certainly interesting because we know zinc does things in terms of viral infectivity and in terms of limiting how much of an inflammatory response you get to a virus and inhibiting viral replication. So that, I think, vitamin D and zinc certainly are important. And then in general, the nutrients we know that are important for the immune system. We know that vitamin C is important. And as you get an infection, your demand or your requirement probably increases. I mean, what sometimes you actually see is that people who are really severely ill, if you were to measure them, then blood levels are at scurvy levels. So you use a lot more vitamin C. And again, you see these protocols being used, and there are case reports published, and there are studies ongoing with high-dose vitamin C not to cure, but to make sure that people get back on their feet faster. They spend less time on a ventilator. They have a lower risk of going on ventilators. I'd definitely say make sure you get plenty of vitamin C through food and supplementation. Because what's the worst thing you can do if you get too much vitamin C? You get, diarrhea or just like a bit digestive upset. So you're not likely to cause major damage there. So make sure you're well covered for vitamin C. And then also talking about Korea and Japan, that there are a couple of studies out of Korea where they looked at some of the lactic acid bacteria you find in kimchi that modulate the immune response in such a way that you both have less, the rate of infection is lower, but also you have a lower risk if you're infected of getting the cytokine storm. I mean, it's also this strange, in the first place, you want a sufficiently aggressive immune system to make sure you don't get infected or you limit the viral infection before it gets a foothold. But once it gets a foothold, you actually don't want an exaggerated immune response because it becomes too aggressive. Then you basically auto-combust or self-destruct. The act of war goes to the point where you basically bomb yourself into obliteration. And so we know that, and we also know for a proper immune response, iron is important. So iron deficiency, and also some of the problems we see, probably there seems to be a link between this particular virus and it interferes with hemoglobin function. It might lead to hemoglobin breakdown as well. So because you get people who, when they become really ill, who have symptoms that look like hypoxia, right? Like lack of oxygen. So they get this strange thing because you have iron being dumped out of hemoglobin and hemoglobin being destroyed. On the one hand, you have some of the symptoms of anemia. On the other hand, you have some of the symptoms of excess iron, of hemochromatosis, because iron in the wrong place literally rusts. So there's something, making sure you're covered for iron in the first place, and then that you're getting plenty of antioxidants through food and foods that induce your antioxidant response elements, And there's this emerging, story with not just with the particular lactic acid bacteria they found in kimchi, but your gut microbiota and your whole gut microbiome and your immune response in general, and also your ability to withstand the viral infections. That's, go for a gut healthy diet. Consider probiotics or individual remedying of whatever's off. If you do stool samples, things like that. That would probably make sense. And then some of these medicinal mushrooms, not the ones that are psychedelic, but things like shiitake, or psilocybin, but things like shiitake, reishi maitake. At least if you look at them, theoretically, that should be beneficial because they seem to enhance your ability to lower viral infection rates and at the same time limit a cytokine storm. And then, because a lot of people get lung issues, we know that glutathione is really important in terms of protecting the lungs. So, getting the foods that sort of make sure that you have good, robust production of glutathione, to get plenty of sulfurous amino acids from eggs, from dairy products, unless you're allergic or intolerant to them, from cruciferous vegetables and all these vegetables in the onion family, onion, garlic, chives, spring onions, and so forth. And then eat all these vegetables that induce glutathione synthesis. So the cruciferous vegetables, watercress, curcumin, berries, especially the very dark ones, like proper blueberries, chokeberries, that sort of thing, right? Because they induce glutathione synthesis. And also some of the leafy greens, even if they're not, think like kale, but parsley, flat leaf parsley as well. So you definitely want to support your glutathione synthesis. And again, there are a couple of case reports of either IV glutathione or high dose oral liposomal glutathione or N-acetyl glutathione, so the forms that actually get into your bloodstream, or even a nebulizer with glutathione, where people did better than you'd expect them once they got to the point of having respiratory problems or even being, needing to go on a ventilator. So there's definitely something worth trying there as well. And again, some of these things you can't do wrong, you can't do damage. And of course, that's not to say, oh, well, I take glutathione, vitamin C, vitamin D, zinc, and medicinal mushrooms, and now I'm going to walk into the emergency room with everyone coughing, not using a face mask or some sort of respiratory guard, and not practicing hygiene. That would be deliberately stupid. Because of course we still need to do these things. Consider making sure we don't get mouth-to-hand transmission, mouth-to-mouth transmission, obviously, and direct transmission through aerosol. So the debate about masks rates back and forth, but I think that's one measure that, along with other things, can actually lower rate of transmission. I mean, again, it's interesting. Korea, Japan, Taiwan, where people in general will wear face masks because they think it lowers spreading of all these airborne diseases. Well, what's the rate of infection? How many people die per 1,000 or 10,000 people there? Way less than any other part of the world. But again, that's just one thing that also shows another approach to public hygiene and limiting potential transmission from yourself to others if you're a carrier infected, or from others to you. But basic health, making sure, and then with zinc, vitamin D, and also probably some of these anti-inflammatory herbs would make sense, especially if you get to the point where you get significant inflammation, your curcumin and maybe boswellia as well. If you get to the point where you're afraid of a cytokine storm, and then also higher doses of omega-3 fatty acids, especially if you get into cytokine storm situation. And then that's also, we can actually see that corticosteroids, hydrocortisone, prednisolone, and so forth, they work, but only if people have not to lower the infection rate, because actually if they're immunosuppressants, but if you have an infection and then you put people on low dose prednisolone or hydrocortisone, they're less likely to get really severe respiratory distress, or if they have severe respiratory distress, fewer people die. So that's, and then hydroxyquinone and chloroquine is kind of hard to figure out what's going on, because it's the research and the communication is such a mess. And out of France, you had the guy in Marseille who seemed to have effects. He also combined it with azithromycin, and they also gave zinc at the same time. And then you have some studies that show no effects or detrimental effects, but some of those then turned out to be doctored, and then you have some studies where they treat people with too high doses, and then you get cardiovascular complications. So they said, well, the risk-reward ratios is unacceptable. Yeah, but I'd say that's pretty poor research. If you start putting people on a degree of hydroxychloroquine that would cause cardiovascular problems, especially because a population group that are likely to get COVID-19, a lot of them have cardiovascular problems in the weakened heart in the first place. So it's kind of hard to see where, what's actually, what's the clear picture? If anything, and that's a big if, then it might be that if it's given to people early in low doses, and people who don't have pre-existing heart conditions, as part of a total intervention, maybe it might just lower, the risk of getting a very poor outcome a bit.
That's kind of what we've done as well from that approach. Exactly. We're not saying here that hydroxychloroquine is a prophylactic. We're saying that once there is an acute infection that has progressed to the point of an immune overload, perhaps at that point, perhaps it could be something, because it's an immune suppressant anyway, that you could add on to lower the burden. But we're saying, I think, if I read you clear, there's a lot of things that we should be doing prophylactically that you nailed it, starting with the T, and then going through the vitamins and minerals you talked about, the compounds, and then let's work on doing that first. But also, if we did get infected and there was sort of an acute process, bringing up those things, again, no harm, no foul, that could subdue the severity of the infection. Am I getting that right?
Exactly. Yeah. So that's still, you want to practice hygiene, at an acceptable level where you don't shut down a country completely. Well, there have been some places where you need to do that for a short period of time to make sure things didn't get out of hand, like northern Italy, where short-term their healthcare system almost collapsed, right? But so make sure you lower the risk of transmission. That's by thinking about how you act in public and distancing, but at a sane level, not and then making sure that your own immune resilience, you enhance that, or at least make sure that it's there by being healthy. And there are some basic nutrients that you want to make sure you get enough of. Selenium probably also would be of interest, although I haven't seen anyone do a lot of research. Well, actually, there is Margaret Raymond from Surrey University, they did from China, not intervention studies, but retrospective studies where they saw a correlation between selenium levels and disease burden.
Wow.
Interesting. So there is in China where people have more selenium, both in food, but also when they checked from hair samples or finger and toenail clippings, that correlated with lower rates of transmission and fewer people who got severely ill if they were infected. So selenium. So make sure you get these things. And they won't make you immune to the point where you could go and snog someone who's just come off or on their way on a ventilator or respirator. But so I think some of the public large scale interventions we do should be in place. Again, you have to find a balance so you don't like completely shut down, whole economies and countries. But that's not the whole thing. That's not saying you should still make yourself more resilient or your body better able to handle if you get infected and exposed by being more healthy in general. And then we have these levels of add-ons we can add where most of them can't do any harm. So even if they don't work, there's this, although that's not particularly for this, but I saw a study published not long ago from some of the faculty from the Linus Pauling Institute at Oregon State University, where they looked at a slightly more potent multivitamin mineral given to people in their 50s or above. I think it was over a 12-week period. And what they could see is that the burden of milder of infectious disease was lower. They spent fewer days ill. There were fewer circumstances. And that picture's been seen several times with, a strong multivitamin mineral with maybe slightly high doses of vitamin C and things like that. Again, if you then still eat a really poor diet, and I think that's maybe also why, like from a public healthcare point of view, people are like, oh, don't take supplements. Also when we talk about disease of civilization, because there are these fundamentals we don't have in place, okay, so you take lots of supplements, but you smoke, you're still in it. Your health account is still negative. It's still running a deficit, right? Or you're not physically active, but you take alpha lipoic acid. Well, I think physical activity would do more for your blood sugar regulation or so forth. Or you're not eating all your vegetables, but you take zinc. What do you think is better for your immune resilience? So I partially understand why when you get also maybe some of the dietetic associations, you can't just take a supplement or nutrient will boost your immunity. Well, it's both right and wrong.
Yes.
But so also think okay, have you achieved this stage? Well, then there are things you can add on top. But if you don't have that in place, don't add on top. Like if you get the best running shoes, it doesn't matter if you're not a good runner. So if you get these new Nike Air Zoom Huaraches that were used for the first sub-2 marathon, that might actually be made illegal.
Yeah.
Well, if you haven't run a marathon or if you haven't done the training for a marathon, who cares about those shoes? On the other hand, if you're a really good medium and long distance runner, those shoes will make a discernible difference for you.
Well, I like how you put that, because ultimately, and folks, I want you to catch this. We have another episode with Umahro that talks about in depth the type 2 diabetes. So I want you to listen to that episode, this episode, and take the advice that was given today. I think the key thing that I heard today, and I completely 1,000% am in agreement with, change you. Change you. Start with the person in the mirror and don't back off. Umahro, how do people get a hold of and get connected with you?
Yeah, well, if you're English speaking, a good place to get connected with me or get inspiration is follow me on social media. So if you follow me on Instagram, where it's just my name, Umahro, some Instagram handle, Umahro, so UMAHRO. On Facebook, there's my personal profile, Umahro, and then there's my sort of company profile, Umahro Food Can Change Your Life. And it's a mixture of Danish, so there's Danish content there, but there's also, I'll do stuff in English, plus you can hit the translate button, and sometimes the translations are a bit dodgy, or you get some funny sentences and things, but so do that. There's my website, but that's all in Danish, so umahro.dk as well, and then you could also consider that my books are not out in English yet, but they will be out in 2021 or 2022, depending on how fast we can fix that. And also, I'm about to relaunch version 2 of Umahro Universe, which is my digital health universe with information about diet, nutrition, 2 TV channels, one with cooking, one with these little episodes about health. At the moment in Danish, but once we have that running smoothly, we will do it in English as well.
I can't wait. And absolutely, I'm excited about your books being translated into English. Those will be in my office and will dispersed to the people that we're talking to today. I want you to have access to Umahro. Follow him in social media. I do. I get inspired by them, and it's always a pleasure to get to speak with this man because of his passion, his knowledge, his inspiration, and his ability to communicate is superior because he can break complex subjects down to terms that everyone can understand in stories that stick, not just in your head, but in your heart. Umahro, thank you from the bottom of my heart for joining us on another episode. I really appreciate you.
Thank you for having me. And all of you out there listening, thank you for listening. And I just want to applaud you for already taking care or embarking upon that path, that journey of taking care of your own health, and do exactly as you said, start with the person in the mirror in front of you, because you can certainly change things. And hopefully that also has like a ripple effect, so other things change. And it might be unfair, other things ought to be changed in the first place, but the only place where you have some sort of locus of control is with you and your immediate family and friends and your close circle. So start there, because there you can definitely make a difference and have an impact.
Amazing and inspirational, Umahro Cadogen. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us in another episode of Healthcare's Missing Link. Don't let the things that are hidden in life, in lifestyle, in culture bog you down. Change you with the person in the mirror. As always, after every episode, I remind you to subscribe to see what's coming up next. And we're so grateful that you joined us today. We look forward to seeing you on next episode of Healthcare's Missing Link.